Alright guys, welcome back to Tomboy Official. This episode we're going to be talking about a topic that I haven't really brought up before. So this topic is called dysphoria, and a lot of people have heard about dysphoria and kind of know what it means in general. And so I'm going to look at some definitions that the internet shows, just because I think that's usually where people are usually looking for their information, right? A lot of times, especially nowadays, I mean, we're not going into libraries, the internet is our main resource. So in the dictionary, it says that, it comes from psychiatry. And dysphoria is a state of unease or generalized dissatisfaction with life. They give examples about depression, dysphoria, mania, anxiety disorders. And, it has information about the origins being from Greek, from dysphoros, meaning hard to bear, or the Greek dysphoria. And then in the mid-19th century, they say dysphoria, but it is derived from the Greek dysphoros, which means hard to bear. So basically, when something is hard to bear, what that means is it's difficult to cope with, right? So usually there's a level of distress that's difficult for a person to cope with. So distress can mean anything that's kind of a negative emotional experience, or even negative thought experience. And that can lead to, usually it's the emotions that are going to be leading to these thoughts and leading to different behaviors and actions, right? And so when you look at this this chart that is shown, and it says definitions from Oxford Languages, and there's a chart that shows the term for dysphoria, showing that in 2019, that's the maximal amount of mentions that you'll see with this term dysphoria. And so that means, people are having the experience, labeling the experience, talking about the experience, and having it's coming up more. So the chart basically shows that from 1800s and 1850, 1900s, and then you start seeing a rise in the 1950s with the term being used a little bit more often in the 1950s, and then some way halfway between the 1950s and 2019, it's basically half the amount that it started being used in 2019. So in the early 2000s, it seems like that's when the term started rising in use in mainstream culture. And that's something important to note, because sometimes people don't have the words to explain things, right? And language changes over time. We do have a lot of, I guess you would call it, political and, political correct terminology, and terminology that's considered more trauma informed. For example, we don't call people crazy. At least in the field I work in, that's a term that we don't really use. Working in the mental health profession, you might say, oh, that dog went crazy or something like that. You might use it, or my computer's going crazy. You might use it in a way that's usually okay, you're not going to address a person as crazy, identifying a person as crazy, or, something like that. It's kind of considered not okay nowadays, and especially in the field I work in, it's not okay. But in, past times, people would use that kind of language to talk about all kinds of people. They would just label people with whatever kind of symptoms or diagnoses they would see coming up, and just like, that person's traumatized, or that person's schizophrenic, or that person, it's kind of like that. It doesn't really settle very well. And it's very, like, there's nothing wrong with having a diagnosis or symptoms, but when someone's like labeling that at you, it's a little bit different, right, than just being like calling yourself that or joking around or something, right? If someone else labels you this, it's like a negative thing. So the reason why I mentioned that is because a lot of times you see language changing when it comes to symptoms or problems or issues that are arising in the mainstream culture. That can be either people are now commonly using this term, or it's not that people weren't ever feeling this way, but now there's common language for them to express it and to talk about it in a way that people now know this is the word you use, dysphoria. Maybe everyone doesn't know, but it's I honestly, when I first started working in the mental health field, let me see, when I was in school, I don't think I heard the term dysphoria very often. It was something that came up more often, probably, in the last couple years, really, I started seeing it more, and especially with more like trans representation and different like gender related like representations coming out in the media, and different topics and discussions surrounding that. The topic of dysphoria does come up more, but it's not always only used for gender, but it just, in general, it says generalized dissatisfaction with life, or unease. So dysphoria means that there's something uncomfortable or distressing happening, right? And ultimately what happens is when there's some kind of discomfort or distress or something that people are having difficulty coping with, that comes out in other ways. So it's usually not so much only the problem of having dysphoria as an experience, but what that leads to and what that limits for a person, or what that does to a person. And so let's see, so when we start looking at gender dysphoria, so gender dysphoria is specifically related to a person's, it's dysphoria related to a person's gender. So the page I'm reading was last reviewed in 2011, and this is from hse.ie. I don't even know. It's like a health organization of a sort. And just looking at the article that was written, it has an introduction. It has signs of gender dysphoria, causes of gender dysphoria, diagnosing gender dysphoria, treating gender dysphoria, intervention for gender dysphoria, hormone therapy for gender dysphoria, and surgery for gender dysphoria. And those are all the topics that come up on this health related post. So just looking at the very introduction part, and I'm not going to look too much into that. I'm more interested in talking more about how it relates to a person's daily life, kind of like in modern everyday life, what that might look like if someone has gender dysphoria, and how they might actually be able to kind of deal with it. Again, this isn't professional advice. It's kind of more like, take it like, it's just food for thought, things to think about. Yes, I come from a background in psychology, so when I talk, sometimes I get all psychological about things, and like that's just because that's where my frame of reference is coming from. So so let's move forward with this. So gender dysphoria, it says gender dysphoria is the distress experienced by those whose gender identity feels at odds with aspects of their birth body. And so, and it says this can be experienced as physical discomfort and psychological and emotional distress. Social factors are often key in the experience of gender dysphoria. Biological sex is assigned at birth, depending on the appearance of the genitals. Gender identity is the gender that a person identifies with or feels themselves to be. And then it breaks all of those things down. And so when we look at gender dysphoria, just like we were saying before, the distress, the emotional distress, the physical discomfort. So what would that look like? So what would it look like for someone to have physical discomfort with their gender? And it says, this can be based on their gender. It says gender identity is the gender that a person identifies with or feels themselves to be. So the way a person identifies their gender doesn't have anything to do with biologically your sexual organs, or the appearance of those sexual organs. And I kind of like the way that's worded, the appearance, because not everybody's genitals are completely like one way or the other, right? There is some in between sometimes, and that's normal too. I mean, it just biologically, some people are just born that way, and that's fine. But usually you'll see, most topics people will talk about male genitals. So genitals for males, usually, you have the internal and external sex organs. Same for females. You have internal and external sex organs. And then there are intersex people that have a variation of types of sex organs, either externally, internally, functional or non-functional types of organs, that, like you can be a female on the outside and have internal male organs, or opposite. You can have external male organs with with a uterus or something along those lines. You can have any variations of different sort of things. Like, people are born all different sort of ways. And so a lot of times what's usually expected is when you're biologically, when you're born, you have genitals and people look at them and they're like, oh, this person has a penis, they're a man. This one has a vagina, it's a woman. Or, it's a male, it's a boy, and a female, it's a woman, it's a girl. These terms usually in the hospital, people are going to be labeling this already. From the second you get out, somebody wants to know. I mean, I don't really know many people or anybody. I mean, for caring for your baby, you would have to know like what their body looks like and what's going on with it, so you know how to properly care for the baby. But a lot of times, depending on the genitals of the baby, especially what's external on the baby, you're gonna see people reacting differently, treating somebody differently, expecting different things from this baby already. As far as like the name, if a baby's born with a penis, they're likely not gonna be like, oh, I'm gonna name my baby, I don't know, like Sarah, or something that's like, Jillian, or something that's like, very like female name. In our culture, that's not super likely that someone's gonna see a baby that's born with male biological sex organs externally and just start doing stereotypically female related things, culturally stereotypically female related things to that baby, or vice versa. Usually it's like almost everything, from the second the baby's born, your birth certificate has the information. People are calling you different ways. They, react to you in different ways. They, dress you in certain ways. And, that is changing. I've talked about before how I've had friends who, they, purposely didn't do the pink or blue for their children and things like that. Or like, they would let their kid decide, what do you want to wear? What haircut do you want? Like, what colors are you interested in? What styles do you want? What hobbies do you want to have? What toys do you want to play with? They weren't just like, oh, you're a girl, let's go to the all pink Barbie section, and oh, you're a boy, let's go to the section with all the cars and the GI Joes and stuff. They would just let their kids just naturally choose. And I think that's very healthy. But I don't think all people in our society do that or understand it. And I think that's what makes it hard for a kid growing up. If your parents allow you to do, just openly be yourself and be authentic, I think that's awesome and great. And I would really encourage that for people. But also, it's hard for the kid. But then also it can be hard for the kid on the other end too. If it's like, you can kind of tell your child is naturally inclined towards certain topics or certain toys or certain clothing and things like this, and you're not really letting them do that because society might say something. And so to protect the kid sometimes, or for people to protect themselves because they don't understand, and they're like, no, I need this kid to be not like this, so they'll sometimes try to make their kid not make those decisions for themselves, and then they develop this form of kind of discomfort, or kind of like, sometimes they don't really, it's not always, but sometimes the kid can be like, oh, like, I have to choose this even though I really want to choose this, like my nature tells me this, and then somebody else is telling me socially I have to do this other thing. And so that's not exactly what we're talking about here, but all those things come up. I mean, they can't really be ignored, right? Because no one's gonna have a baby, wrap it up in a blanket, never look at the genitals, never, you're gonna have to clean your baby eventually within like probably a few seconds or minutes, from the baby being born. You're gonna have to clean it. So you're gonna know a lot about the baby already, but to not treat it, based on the genitals. I mean, because the thing is, a baby that's that young, you might not really know how that, a newborn is really going to feel about their, sex organs. Like, until they start talking or doing behaviors and like doing different stuff, like when they're a little bit older, you're not really going to know. And so, naturally people just seem to kind of want to treat their kids what society teaches them to kind of teach their kids or treat their kids like. But then I think when people are very in tune with their child, they notice. I really do think that parents oftentimes notice things. They know, like, they look and they have eyes and they're not blind, and they're with this baby so much that they can kind of tell different parts of its characteristics, what makes it smile, what makes it grumpy, and they can tailor the way they raise the baby and care for the baby and love their baby, like in this way. But a lot of times people don't really always want to do that. And it's a hard decision too. I don't have kids, but if I did, I think it would be a difficult decision. If depending who or where you live or where you're at, some environments really aren't accepting. Where I live, I mean, I'm in Southern California, and so, it's known for diversity, for, open-minded thinking and, kind of forward-thinking environments. We have Los Angeles. I mean, San Francisco's a little up, like north of here, but I mean, still, like, there's so much diversity. There's so much, like, international influence, multicultural influence that, we really have to out here. We really can't, like, ignore it. I know some people can, or some people try, but it's really hard to just ignore that kind of thing. We can't really ignore what's going on in our society because there's so much diversity that a lot of times we come across different types of people. And depending on the work you do, the jobs you do, the places you hang out, the people you interact with, like, for example, sorry, there's like music going on. I do these recordings in a parking lot, and so there's a lot of music going on. But yeah, people just basically don't always know how to react. Parents might not know how to raise their kids, all the time, or they're gonna have these conversations with their kids at a very early young age that, hey, like, I'm okay with you doing this and you're okay the way that you are, but if if you're out in public doing these certain things or wearing these certain clothes or playing with these certain toys, people might make a comment. And, you can talk about how you feel about it, and we can talk about how you can address it, and you can always bring it up if it happens, and like even trying to put in place like a game plan for how to address it, if and when it comes up. That can be really helpful too, so that the whole thing isn't ignored. It's not going to be like ignored by the parent, but also that's a tough decision too, because nobody wants their kid getting bullied, nobody wants their kid to like stick out or whatever. But then I think a lot of people want their kids to authentically be themselves, but then sometimes it doesn't resonate with the parent, and they're like, wait, this kid isn't like me in these certain other ways, and they just can't really understand it. And that can become detrimental to the child's upbringing when the parent is kind of like really forcing their own agenda. Because kids are strong-willed, and it's not always a bad thing. It's not always a bad thing that kids have their own perspectives in lives and want to be their own selves. I mean, they're gonna need guidance for sure, but what that guidance looks like, oftentimes can be troublesome. It can be problematic when somebody's really just trying to like control everything, and then it can be also problematic when somebody's like, oh, we're free-spirited and I'm gonna let this kid like raise themselves, and then they might not have a lot of direction there either. So it really is needed to have some kind of a middle ground, some discipline, structure, patterns, but also being understanding and flexible in certain areas too, and just keeping the communication open with everything, really. And so getting back into this, that's kind of like a lot of the thought process going into talking about these different sort of topics. But then when we start talking about, gender dysphoria and the gender identity aspect of things, it says here, so this is interesting. It says here, people who have long-lasting and extreme gender dysphoria are known as transsexuals. While biological sex and gender identity are the same for most people, this isn't the case for everyone. For example, some people may have the body of a man but identify themselves as a woman. Others may not feel they're either male or female, right? So just because somebody has the body of a man, of a man or a woman, and don't identify with it, doesn't necessarily mean that they have dysphoria, unless there's distress related to it, and there has to be a significant amount of distress. It can't just be like, oh, like, it has to be, there's a lot that goes into gender dysphoria. It says this mismatch between sex and gender identity can lead to distressing and uncomfortable feelings that are called gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a recognized medical diagnosis for which intervention is sometimes appropriate. It is not a mental illness. So it's saying a medical diagnosis, not a mental illness. Some people with gender dysphoria have a strong desire to live according to their gender identity rather than their biological identity. So basically they're saying that some people would prefer or would like to have a life where they're able to live according to how they identify with their gender, like how they identify themselves, not necessarily how they were born with their sex organs. And that makes sense. I think all of this makes sense. There are some little pieces that are kind of like, I know it just depends on a person's interpretation of these things, but for someone to be called a transsexual, also, I think a person has to label themselves that, right? And so it says trans terms. Trans people identify in a variety of terms, including trans, transsexual. It says male/female, non-binary, etc. And it says some trans people have interventions to make their physical appearance more consistent with their gender identity. So it's saying here that when they talk about trans, so under the term trans is, someone who can identify as trans, transsexual, male, female, non-binary, and they say etc. because there are other types of terms. But I find that interesting that, they break it down that way. And again, so when you think of it, a person who's trans would have to say, I'm a trans person, or they would say, I'm a trans person and I'm, I identify as non-binary, or their own label, right? I can't look at somebody and say you're trans, or look at somebody else and say you're not trans. And the reason for that is because I don't know if a person has, a relationship to their own gender identity, comparing that to the biological sex organs that they were born with. I don't know that person's internal experience, emotional and psychological experience with that connection. And because I don't know that, even if they tell me, I can't say, oh, you're trans. Because if they don't consider themselves trans, then they're not trans. And so I think that's where people can get confused with a lot of things, is because terminology, especially in American culture, we love labeling. We got to label everything. Like, people can't let it go. They're like, wait, but what do you call yourself? What do you mean you don't subscribe to labels? What do you mean you don't have, like, we need you to label yourself. You're going to need to have a label. You need to have a label. You need to check the boxes. You need to put just put something. You need to put something, it's like we need to have a way of identifying you. But for the person themselves, intrinsically, they might not really care, or, they might really care, but they might not want to say it. It's everyone's own right to be able to identify themselves when they feel it's appropriate. It's not always safe. It's not always comfortable, and you shouldn't always have to. It can be rude, It's almost like, sometimes you'll, like, at least where I live, sometimes I'll hear people speaking different languages, and most languages I can pick up. I'm like, oh, I understand what that language is, even though I don't understand the language. But it can be a little odd if I like hear language, I overhear something, I'm like, I don't recognize that. It's a complete stranger. I come out of the blue to this couple having a conversation in a language I don't understand, and like, excuse me, like, what's your language? What language are you speaking? Even if I'm complimenting it and then trying to like have this whole conversation about their background and where were you born and where are you from, and it's like, there's some level of inappropriateness to that, especially if they're not like in a setting where they're trying to like engage with you in conversation. And so I'd say it's the same thing almost, when somebody's, gender identity, how they're presenting externally, and you see them in the world, it's not going to be necessarily polite or appropriate to be coming up, approaching people and being like, hey, are you trans? Like, how do you identify? Like, I don't even know your name, but I want to know, like, if you identify, I want to know your pronouns, I want to know like all this stuff about you. And it's kind of, some things are kind of personal to people, so that's that can be a real turn off to a lot of people. They're, and they don't want to talk about it with complete strangers. It's kind of nosy, but also, it can be, there can be people who are allies or who are just curious, and it's hard to really, it can be hard to really know like where a person's coming from with their questions. And their questions are valid, and the way you feel about how you do or don't want to answer to it is valid too. So everyone's experience with these types of things is going to be completely different, but there's going to be some overlap too. So they talk about how common it is. They say it's estimated that 1 in 4,000 people are receiving medical interventions for gender dysphoria. So if 1 in 4,000 people, that's not a big percentage. But also to receive a medical intervention, whether that's a physical type of invasive surgery or something non-invasive, or like pills of some sort, like medications, or like an intervention. I don't know if they consider like therapy to be a medical intervention, but it is a type of intervention, health related intervention. And so they say 1 in 4,000, so we can assume it's going to be more than 1 in 4,000 people having that experience, because not everybody with the experience is going to get a medical intervention. That's only the people who know that they can, who are comfortable doing it, who can afford it with the time or the expense or the transportation, or have access to those sorts of services. Because where I live, there are options, and there's still super limited options. San Diego, Los Angeles, Orange County, it's super limited, but it's still a lot more forward than a lot of places. A lot more advanced than a lot of places. There's some countries and some states where it's like not even, legal. It's not like legal or possible to really get these interventions without like a whole lot of like, you'd have to be labeled as, severe condition in need of this type of intervention. Versus, it might be more flexible where I live, but it's still not like 100% great. Like some people do say too, that they get medical interventions, for their, hormone therapies, and different types of, because of the hormone therapies or other surgeries they may have had, they might have pain conditions now permanently, unfortunately. Because of that, it might be physical pain conditions, and because they're not able to go into specialists to get their treatment during COVID, because a lot of places, specialist offices aren't considered essential. I don't know why, but so it's someone else making these decisions and saying this isn't essential for say, for example, a trans person to go in and get the treatment that they need routinely, because this isn't an essential treatment. So that's something that's coming up that's not, I don't like hearing that. It's really hard for me to hear, that people can't get the treatment and support and help that they need, even though they were getting it already, maybe even long term, or if they were supposed to start it but they can't, and like all these different things. So that's something else that's coming up even more and more now that wasn't coming up in the past, but already services were limited and still are even more so limited now, which is pretty terrible. And when it says gender terminology, so gender dysphoria is common and can be difficult to understand. It helps to distinguish between the meanings of gender-related terms. Gender dysphoria, discomfort or distress caused by a mismatch between a person's gender identity and their biological sex assigned at birth. Transsexualism, the desire to live and be accepted as a member of the opposite sex, usually accompanied by the wish to have treatment to make their physical appearance more consistent with their gender identity. The term usually accompanied by that wish, I don't know. I don't know. I'm just reading this. I don't know if it's usually accompanied. I don't know if it's usually. I don't know if that's like something that, that trans people usually want their physical appearance to be more consistent with their gender identity, because I don't know if people usually want that. I know that it's definitely common, it is common that people do want that, but I don't know if it's like more than half of the people. To me, usually means that more so than not. That's what usually means to me. Often is different than usually. I don't know. I'm just too much thinking into this term, but I really don't know. I'm just reading this, so don't hate on me if it's not accurate. But it's saying the desire, to live and be accepted as a member of the opposite sex. Opposite sex as in they were born with a certain set of biological sex organs, so their sex assigned at birth is based on those organs. So the opposite sex would be the opposite to what their genitalia made it so that their paperwork says. I don't really know. I'm not up to date with intersex newborns and the process with intersex people. I find that interesting. I think people should have the right to say if they're intersex or not, if they want to, or if they don't want to, they shouldn't have to mention it. But I'm wondering if they do have an option, maybe like on a driver's license or birth certificates and things like that, like official documents, if a person is intersex at birth. Because I feel like, from what I know, it seems like people are forced to choose, like the parents are forced to choose, or somebody is forced to choose. I don't know, and I'm not up to date on this, but I don't know if there's any process really for a person's parents or even doctors or whoever to choose the label of the birth gender or sex, if you want to call it that. So the sex at birth, if that's like, if there's more than just like male or female options on there. I haven't seen anything like that where there is. I know later on, like if you're looking at demographic forms and different sorts of like medical and other types of settings, it's rare, but you might see the options for different sorts of gender identities. But it's not like super common. I would say it's not like 100%. Like if you go to the DMV, I don't think that they have like intersex, or non-binary and different terms like that. But intersex would still be a sex. So there's male and female and there's intersex. But I don't know if intersex is probably broken down into multiple types of categories as well. Like subcategories. But I don't know the terms for those. But it would be interesting to look into. It says transvestism, where a person occasionally wears clothes typically associated with the opposite gender. It says in parentheses, cross-dressing, and then it says for a variety of reasons. So that's kind of an interesting word, because I don't know if people usually use the term transvestite anymore or often. In the place where I live, in my area, region of the world, that term is kind of outdated, almost offensive, and when you do see it, it's more like a it's like a derogatory label that somebody else is saying against another person. Usually that's when I've seen somebody say it. Like, say they'll be like sitting somewhere and they'll see a person that they can't really, clearly tell what their gender is, based on just like first glance, or if there's like a clear a clear kind of maybe there's a person in a dress who has a full-on beard and mustache and is wearing a dress and heels, and a wig, somebody might see this person and say, this person is a transvestite. But, I mean, I don't know if they are, because I think the person would have to say that they're a transvestite. And I don't really hear people using that word, because it's interesting, because that would mean that the term tomboy would fit under transvestism. And basically anybody who kind of wears clothing typically, like it's worded, clothes typically associated with the opposite gender. So, I mean, that can vary in so many different ways, but I don't really hear people use it. I mean, again, like, where I live is different than where some other people live, but usually when I've seen that term used, it's usually in two settings. Usually I've seen it used like in a derogatory way, like someone almost making fun and saying, oh, that person's a transvestite. Kind of like, it almost makes it seem like, oh, they don't really understand that person, and so they're labeling them this. It usually takes a derogatory connotation, and not always, but it can. And then also I've seen it used in, entertainment settings where it's like, somebody will, maybe like in the media or something, where somebody's like the character, it's like a character that's like a transvestite. But I've never, I mean, of all the people I know of all different backgrounds, and I'm telling you, like, working in a mental health setting and meeting people all the time, whether that's screenings, I mean, so many different people that I come across from so many different segments, from so many different places, I've never yet come across somebody who identifies themselves as a transvestite. And I would never be comfortable calling somebody a transvestite, but I don't really know if that's like an appropriate term anymore, or if people just don't use it, or maybe it's like a medical word. I really don't know. I'm pretty ignorant on that, but I wouldn't be comfortable using the word transvestite to describe a person, because it seems kind of like I'm looking at you and your physical appearance and placing this label on you, saying something. It's almost like, in a way, there's more behind it than just the phrasing of a person wearing clothes that are typically associated with the opposite gender. It's more like judging the person for wearing clothes that are associated with the opposite gender. That's kind of more what it seems like when someone uses the word transvestite. It seems like it's a judgmental type of terminology. So that's kind of how I'm taking that term. Non-binary, that's something that a lot of people hear a lot more often. So it says non-binary, an umbrella term for gender identities that fall outside the gender binary of male or female. This includes individuals whose identity is neither exclusively male nor female, a combination of male and female, or between or beyond genders. I always like that, beyond genders. That's pretty cool. Like it's kind of like, screw genders, like, we don't need this. Like, it's kind of limiting. I don't know, I always find it to be like such a limiting thing. It's like, man, like, just like gender itself is just such a limiting freaking thing. It's just like, okay, like, me labeling myself as this doesn't really tell you anything about me, like, I always feel weird when I check a certain box where it's like, yeah, I'm female, but I mean, like, that doesn't really tell you anything. Like, I'm female, but if you gave me like an interview or like a profile to create and just didn't put any pictures, I don't seem like a female on paper. So I feel like it's kind of not even like necessary to put that information in there. It's something that's interesting that I come across a lot, because I'm on Fiverr a lot. I'm on I kind of do collaborative things with different like digital marketing types of people, and I kind of collaborate with people who do freelance work and stuff like that. And so I'm often like chatting back and forth with people about different sorts of projects I'm working on and things, trying to get advice and different sorts of information, and like some, like, help me out with this thing, like the algorithm, all these kind of different things. It's kind of funny how often I get called sir. It's like people just assume I'm a guy, just because of what I'm doing, I think, and maybe because in that sort of field, it's very common that people are going to be male. But I do find it interesting that people automatically just call me sir. Hey, sir. And that happens to me a lot in settings where I'm not. I mean, even if people do see me, sometimes people will call me sir, or like be kind of like a little bit like, oh wait, sorry, I didn't know you weren't like a male, or but it doesn't happen so often, but it happens enough that I can say that it happens. But yeah, so it's just kind of interesting to me that that people often will be like sir, or like on YouTube comments, like not on this channel, but I have other channels where if I'm talking about finance, or talking about video games, or talking about repairing like some kind of like techie thing, or other types of topics that I might talk about, like about THC or CBD and stuff like that, and people are always like sir, 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 sir. And I know my voice is a bit low, it's not like super high, but it's also kind of interesting to me that it's like, oh, people call me sir whenever I don't put my face on something. I've noticed it often people will say sir, or buddy, or dude, or people aren't usually referring to me as like female terms, and I don't mind, but I just find it kind of interesting too that it's like people automatically like assume that I'm a certain sex because of the things that I'm doing online, even though they've never seen me, and I've never said anything. If I don't say my name, then people don't really seem to know. And so I kind of appreciate that experience, because it's kind of interesting to me, but it does happen. So the next part under non-binary says, similar to the usage of transgender, people under the non-binary umbrella may describe themselves using one or more of a wide variety of terms. See definition of androgynous, gender fluid, genderqueer, gender variant. Gender dysphoria isn't the same as transvestism or cross-dressing. Gender identity and sexual identity are separate issues. People with gender dysphoria may identify as straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, or pansexual, and this may change with intervention. Okay. That's an interesting, I'm sorry, but that's kind of interesting to me. I don't know. I never thought about that. That never came to my mind. Wow. That, so these interventions that people can go through can change their, a person's identification. The reason why I'm laughing is because, I can see this going two different directions. So the one I was laughing at almost was, and I don't think conversion therapy is funny, but I was almost thinking like, okay, they're kind of almost trying to promote conversion therapy. Almost saying that like if someone labels or identifies themselves as gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, pansexual, etc., that they might have an intervention that makes them identify as straight. But I never really thought about it as an intervention for maybe a straight person going in, and after the intervention, now they identify themselves differently. Usually, it's kind of interesting that the what would you call it? The interventions for conversion therapy are, traumatizing, they're harsh, they're not appropriate. I would consider it a form of torture and inappropriate, treatment of humans. It's not humane. But I think if a person was straight, trying to identify or come to terms with their identity as a gay person or lesbian or bisexual or asexual or pansexual, if a person was straight, I don't think that the interventions would be a harsh intervention, like, we're gonna make you gay, you don't really see that. So, I mean, in my mind, when I was kind of snickering, I'm kind of laughing, just kind of like picturing this in my head. That's like, it kind of depends what you would already identify as, how your interventions might potentially look. And conversion therapy, I'm thankful and glad that I've never experienced that, and that that other places that did have it as legal, some places are making it illegal, which is great to hear. But it still exists, and it's still something that people recommend at times, especially from certain backgrounds, whether that's political or religious or some other social, cultural backgrounds, that people might want a kid or an adolescent or a family member, a friend or church member or somebody that they know to undergo some sort of extreme intervention to become straight. But you don't really see like extremely like negative interventions to become gay. Like, that's not really something you see. But in my mind, I was kind of picturing like, how would that look? How would that be like if a person was like the mainstream, part of like the mainstream, not a minority identity, and then they're like, you have to be gay, we're gonna make you gay because you seem like you should be. And it's like, that would be just interesting. But I don't know what I even think about that few words. This may change with intervention. I think the way a person labels themselves can definitely change. I don't know if an intervention can change a person's actual self. I don't know about that. I think it's just kind of my perspective here. I think that when a person, I think things can be fluid, right? So a person's sexuality can be fluid. You can be straight and then later in life identify as gay, and then later in life identify as pansexual, and then even later in life identify as asexual. That would be normal. I don't think that's like something that never happens, right? I don't think that's like not something that happens. But I don't know if someone else, having an intervention, that someone else can necessarily make it so that you get there. I think that it's kind of a natural process that the person themselves has to go through to get there. And then once they arrive at that place where they've realized that their identity is kind of fluid and kind of in the kind of like transitional phase, I think that's when they're going to realize that. So I do find that interesting. It's just kind of an interesting thought to try to think about, how an intervention can change a person's, identity. 'Cause, doctors, therapists, psychiatrists, whatever the different types of health type of interventions that can come up, they can't make a person be anything that they're not, like authentically that they're not. People can change you externally and give you ideas in certain ways that, you just because somebody says it doesn't mean that that's who you are or how you are. But I do think there is an aspect, definitely, of people discovering things about themselves through different interventions, especially through therapy and different sorts of maybe like shadow work and different things that people do, that they come to terms themselves and say, hey, I don't really think that this label resonates with me. I think I actually identify as this. Like, this kind of resonates with me better than that other one that I was using before. I think that is something that can come through an intervention. I don't think other people can force it out of a person necessarily. I think you can be traumatized out of something or into something. I think that's possible, but I don't really think it's necessarily possible to change someone in a positive method where they actually are happy now that they're this other person, this other identity of a person. But yeah, that's kind of an interesting topic altogether, and I would like to know the research behind that. But I'm going to talk more about the intervention aspect of things when it comes to dysphoria. This was more looking at terminology and a lot of the wording and the kind of thoughts behind what it looks like on the surface. But I haven't touched much on like the thought processes and emotional processes that go on, which I think is important to delve into as well. But I'm going to repark this car in the shade, and then I'm going to actually record more on that, because this is getting close to an hour, and I'm trying to not make them too much over an hour long for these recordings. But on the same topic, and I'm going to go into this other aspect, still talking about gender dysphoria, but more about interventions, more about coping, more about just kind of some food for thought about things that a lot of times get neglected and overlooked. I'm gonna definitely get more into that. So thanks for listening this far, and I don't know, I'd like to know what people think about that, about the gender, about gender dysphoria, and about a person's identity, and if an intervention can lead the identity to change. I think interventions can lead dysphoria to change. I do believe that. I think that interventions can help a person with their distress levels and with their ability to cope with things. I do believe that, or else I wouldn't be working in the field that I'm working in if I didn't think that this stuff works. But I don't know if it can change a person's identity. And I don't know if people are really trying to change someone's... And I'm not saying that that's what this article is even saying, but that's just kind of the way I was reading it. That's like, I don't really know. That kind of sticks out to me. I don't really know if it's possible, but yeah, I'm gonna get more into some more helpful related information. And so, yeah, thanks for listening.